Hello world. Uh, this email was written late last Friday night. I don't know if I'll get a response. It's Saturday night now. It was a email to the Hoover Institution, and I thought I'd share it with you because it kind of tells my story. The subject reads, "A somewhat desperate in treatment for advice and possibly opportunity." Begins with a note. Note: as a lover of English and a believer in its potential for and history of flexibility, I personally would have chosen the word entreaty in the subject line. However, for the sake of propriety, I nevertheless decided to obey Webster's New World and hold back a neologism. Dear Miss Director, I'll lay my cards on the table. At this point in my life, my 28-year-old life, I am ready to face God, cherish the memory of the life I've lived, and assert with a straight face that I've done my best. Perhaps my biggest question for him would be, when was I proud and masked it under the banner of integrity? I am an intellectual by nature. That is not a self-proclamation. I've seen some Peter Robinson interviews on YouTube and am impressed. Most recently, I watched the one with Charles Murray. This is what inspired the email you are now reading. I am a lifelong Cincinnatian, and I see my hometown as a microcosm of Fishtown and Belmont, rolled into one, with extreme differences between neighborhoods and even streets very geographically close. And this has been the case since before I was born. I received a relatively decent education in elementary school and high school. Of course, I'm not disposed to compare my education with that in an alternate life of mine. In college, I was inspired to major in biology and was fortunate to have my parents' financial support and not go into debt. I was performing very well until a young woman fell head over heels for me, the first time in my life it seemed, and I dropped out and got a job. Why? Number one, I am an artist besides being a scientist, and she made me feel invincible, so I felt tremendous potential to succeed in the arts market, and I pursued this ambition unsuccessfully, as most artists do. Two, and more significantly, I took note that the philosophical approach to the sciences in my experience at the university was rather backwards in more ways than one. To begin with, the administration was cynically dropping grade standards openly and explicitly and forthrightly, in organic chemistry, for example. Thus, I reasoned that the integrity of the university was being short-sightedly thrown down the toilet and that my bachelor's degree would be essentially worthless in a meritocratic job market, which I do believe will come back no matter how slickly like schools may peddle their propaganda. So, in a general sense, I simply saw higher education as the next economic bubble, which could only achieve a shred of legitimacy by artificially bloating the respective job markets. Furthermore, even if grades continued to be a popular measure of merit in the short term, I suspected and still suspect more strongly than ever that the hierarchy in the science industry will narrow at an ever accelerating rate and not necessarily diversify to compensate. For example, in medicine, which the vast majority of biology majors were pursuing, I never was, but I'll get to that shortly, the computer revolution has only begun to revolutionize the discipline. This especially will accelerate the narrowing, albeit simply being yet another typical permutation of the general sociological phenomenon Alvin Toffler described in his masterpiece, Future Shock. At bottom, profitable new technologies in medicine will be conceived and made viable by an ever-shrinking minority of hyper-intelligent mutants. Thus, most of the jobs of the future medicine industry will be dryly automatic or plain menial. I would go so far as to assert that even the research and development will probably mostly consist of monotonous number crunching and be boring and unfulfilling. Perhaps most importantly, and in a way that pales my previous rationales toward irrelevance, I found that virtually every course I was taking at the university was disagreeable to my personal ideology. I desired to be a conservationist. I do agree that research is very important in the field of ecological conservation. However, measurable influence is far, far more important in affecting public policy. And the sad fact is that the general public does not read unnecessarily thorough and research-driven books by authors even as well known as Edward O. Wilson, which tend to lack a passionate and compellingly explicit ideological element. Anyway, I declare that my loftiest goals require more than the arguments of a mere economist or even a humanitarian. It takes a religious reevaluation that would hopefully curb the radical and ultimately irrational genocentrism so central in the basic nature of most higher living organisms. I concluded that the most economical way to gain influence would be to become a more knowledgeable and effective communicator in a very general sense, and it was glaringly obvious that the university was stunting that pursuit more than catalyzing it. It was just a waste of my time and my parents' money. And don't get me started on how the rangers wielding automatic shotguns on the grounds of the African nature preserves probably agree with me wholeheartedly. For the record, there was indeed a conservationist volunteer opportunity at the university, but it involved studying algae in caves. So where am I now in my life? Well, here. Just another tiny voice on the internet, like so many others. It just so happens that I met a girl in Croatia, a native, on a dating website. We've never met in person, but I strongly desire to marry her, and yet I have no realistic idea of how to provide for us or the family we might raise. I am unemployed on disability benefits. At age 20, I was diagnosed as bipolar schizoaffective, which, by the way, I believe contains a deep epigenetic element. I am an extremely ideologically driven man, and I have no doubt, for good reason, that working at a job irrelevant to and divorced from a moral agenda, a merely market-driven one, would certainly cause a crippling psychotic episode. And no matter how much I love Ivana, the Croatian woman, I will not risk another stay in a psych ward. So, I have absolutely no realistic idea of what to do, and the subject line speaks for itself. I hope this email finds you well and that you will respond whether personally or through a colleague. Thanks so much for reading. Sincerely, Jarl Waters.